The dirt road stretched endlessly into the night, its surface swallowed by creeping shadows under the faint glow of a pale crescent moon. Clara gripped the steering wheel tighter as her headlights pierced through the suffocating darkness of the unmarked road. A rusting sign she'd passed hours ago was the last indication of civilization. A crooked warning. Next gas station, 40 miles. She hadn't planned on getting lost, but GPS had failed miles back, her phone useless in the dead zone of the countryside. The plan was simple: drive through the back roads for a shortcut, save time, and make it to her friend's cabin before midnight. But now, with no signal and no sign of life, unease settled into her bones like frostbite. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath her tires. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. It had started an hour ago, a flicker of motion caught in her peripheral vision. At first, she chalked it up to an animal, perhaps a deer grazing along the shoulder of the road. But then came the footsteps. Not loud, but audible enough when she slowed the car. They matched her pace exactly, crunching through the underbrush. When she stopped, so did they. Her pulse quickened, but she dismissed the noise as paranoia. Her windows were closed, her doors locked. It was just her imagination. She turned up the radio, seeking comfort in the crackling static, the only station weekly available out here. But as she drove, the static warped into something else. Faintly, she heard a voice. It was distant, garbled, and unintelligible, but unmistakably human. Clara's breath hitched. She leaned closer to the dashboard as if proximity would help decipher the sound. The voice faded as quickly as it had come, replaced by static once more. Her fingers trembled as she fiddled with the dial, searching for clarity. Nothing. The air felt heavier now, the kind of pressure that makes ears ring. A cold bead of sweat traced its way down her temple. The headlights reflected off something up ahead. Clara slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly as she came to an abrupt stop. Her heart leaped into her throat as the figure came into view. A person standing motionless in the middle of the road. She squinted, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The figure was tall and thin, cloaked in tattered, dark clothing that seemed to ripple unnaturally in the still air. Their face was obscured, head tilted downward like they were staring at their feet. Clara's trembling hand hovered over the gear shift. She could feel her heartbeat in her ears. "Hey," she called out, her voice cracking. The figure didn't respond, didn't move. Adrenaline surged as she debated what to do. There was no way around them. The road was too narrow, flanked by dense skeletal trees. She reached for her phone again, but the screen remained blank. Still no signal. When she looked back up, the figure was gone. Clara gasped, her chest tightening. She scanned the area, her high beams illuminating nothing but the empty road ahead. A chill crept up her spine as the realization hit her. There was nowhere they could have gone. The woods were too thick, the area too open. It was as if they'd vanished into thin air. She slammed the car into drive, her tires kicking up loose gravel as she sped forward. The needle on the gas gauge hovered dangerously close to empty, but she didn't dare stop. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror every few seconds, paranoia convincing her something would appear there. And then it did. A shape materialized in the mirror, something tall and shadowy running directly behind her car. Her breath hitched as she slammed her foot on the gas, the engine groaning in protest. The shadow kept pace, its movements impossibly smooth and fast. It didn't seem to run so much as glide, its limbs jerking unnaturally. Clara screamed, tears streaming down her face as she pressed the pedal to the floor. The shadow didn't falter. Instead, it closed the gap, its inhuman face, pale and featureless, pressing against the glass of her rear window. The car shuddered violently, the steering wheel jerking in her hands as if something had gripped the vehicle and was pulling it back. Clara fought for control, her knuckles white as she swerved. "Please, please, please," she sobbed, praying for the nightmare to end. With a loud pop, the car lurched to one side. A tire had blown, the vehicle skidding off the road and into a shallow ditch. Clara's head slammed against the steering wheel, the sudden impact leaving her disoriented. For a moment, everything was still except for the ringing in her ears. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, a tap on the driver's side window. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she turned her head. The shadow stood inches away, its face now pressed against the glass. Its skin looked like melted wax, features sliding in and out of place. Empty sockets where eyes should have been stared at her, and a grotesque smile stretched impossibly wide across its face. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Clara scrambled to unbuckle her seatbelt, her fingers fumbling as panic consumed her. She flung herself across the passenger seat, reaching for the door handle on the opposite side. She didn't dare look back. With a desperate shove, she threw the door open and tumbled out onto the cold, damp earth. She scrambled to her feet and ran blindly into the woods, branches clawing at her skin like skeletal fingers. Behind her, the sound of footsteps echoed, deliberate and heavy. "Clara." The voice was raspy, a chilling whisper that slithered into her ears. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel it gaining on her, its presence an icy weight against her spine. She stumbled into a clearing, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The forest was eerily silent, the kind of silence that suffocates. Clara spun around, her eyes darting in every direction. The shadow was gone, but the sense of being watched was overpowering. Then she saw them. Dozens of figures stood at the edge of the clearing, their faces blank slates of skin, their bodies draped in tattered clothing. They moved in unison, stepping closer as if controlled by a single mind. Clara backed away, her foot catching on a root. She fell hard, the impact knocking the wind out of her. As they closed in, the static from the radio filled the air, louder and more distorted. The figures stopped, their heads snapping toward the sound. Clara turned, her eyes widening as the faint glow of headlights cut through the trees. A truck roared into the clearing, its horn blaring. The figures recoiled, their forms flickering like bad reception on an old TV before vanishing entirely. Clara barely registered the driver, a grizzled man with a shotgun resting across his lap, before she collapsed into unconsciousness. When she woke, she was in the back of the truck, wrapped in a worn blanket. The man said nothing as he drove her to the nearest town. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes told her everything. He'd seen them too. Years later, Clara still avoids the woods. She never speaks of what happened that night. But sometimes, when she's alone in her apartment with the radio on, she swears she can hear it, the faint sound of footsteps and a voice whispering her name. The wind howled through the abandoned gas station as Jonah's flashlight beams sliced through the darkness. He regretted taking this route, but the detour sign had left him no choice. His truck had sputtered to a halt 20 miles back, and now he was stranded in the middle of nowhere with no cell service and the night pressing in on all sides. The gas station had appeared out of the dark like a mirage. Its faded, open 24-hour sign flickered weakly, though no lights shone from within. The pumps were rusted, the kind that hadn't been used since the 1970s. Still, Jonah hoped there might be a landline, or better yet, someone who could help. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, his heart jumping at the noise. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Rows of dusty shelves stretched into the gloom, stocked with cans and boxes that looked decades old. "Hello?" Jonah called, his voice trembling. The echo was his only reply. He ventured deeper, stepping over broken tiles and shattered glass. Something about the place felt wrong. The temperature dropped noticeably the further he moved, his breath now visible in the beam of his flashlight. He tried to shake the unease. Old buildings always had drafts. It was nothing supernatural. Then he heard it, a faint shuffling sound coming from the back of the store. Jonah froze. His mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe someone was squatting here. But the rhythmic nature of the noise sent a chill down his spine. It was too deliberate, too steady. "Is someone there?" he called out, trying to sound braver than he felt. The shuffling stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing in on him like a physical weight. The beam of his flashlight wavered as he took a step toward the sound. "I'm just looking for help," he said. "My truck broke down. I don't mean any harm." He reached the back of the store, where a narrow hallway led to what he assumed were offices or storage rooms. The shuffling resumed, louder this time, coming from the farthest door. Jonah's stomach twisted. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, but he couldn't help himself. He needed to know what was making that noise. The door at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out from within. Jonah approached slowly, his footsteps muffled by the layer of grime on the floor. His hand shook as he reached for the doorknob and pushed it open. The room was small, filled with stacks of yellowed newspapers and old filing cabinets, but Jonah's eyes were drawn immediately to the center, where a large circular mirror stood propped against the wall. The light was coming from the mirror itself, an unnatural glow that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Jonah's mouth went dry. He stepped closer, unable to tear his gaze away from the mirror. The surface wasn't reflecting the room. Instead, it showed a dark forest, its trees twisted and gnarled. Fog clung to the ground, and shadows moved between the trunks, shadows that didn't belong to anything visible. As he stared, the reflection began to shift. A figure emerged from the mist in the mirror, slowly walking toward him. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face was featureless, just a smooth expanse of skin where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. Jonah stumbled back, nearly dropping his flashlight. The figure in the mirror stopped, tilting its head as if it could see him despite having no eyes. Then it raised one elongated arm and pointed directly at him. The light in the room flickered violently, and the temperature plummeted. Jonah turned to run, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping him inside. His flashlight flickered, plunging him into darkness. The sound of footsteps filled the room, slow, deliberate, and impossibly close. Jonah spun around, his flashlight shaking as he tried to find the source. The mirror glowed faintly again, and he saw his own reflection this time, but something was wrong. His reflection was smiling, its mouth stretching wider and wider until it split unnaturally across its face. "Let me out!" Jonah screamed, pounding on the door. The mirror's light grew brighter, and his reflection stepped forward, pressing its hands against the glass. Its movements didn't match his own anymore. It was independent, alive. The surface of the mirror rippled like water, and the reflection began to push through. Jonah's legs felt like lead as he backed into the corner of the room. The thing emerged fully, its body contorting as it crawled toward him on all fours. Its grin never faltered. Jonah closed his eyes, bracing for the end. But instead of an attack, the thing whispered, its voice low and guttural, echoing as if it came from the depths of a cavern. "Run. Run." The door flew open, and Jonah didn't hesitate. He bolted down the hallway, his flashlight swinging wildly as he sprinted toward the exit. Behind him, the sound of heavy footsteps and guttural laughter chased him. He burst through the front doors and didn't stop running until he reached the road. When he finally dared to look back, the gas station was gone. The lot where it had stood was empty, overgrown with weeds and trees as if it had been abandoned for decades. His truck, too, was nowhere to be seen. Jonah staggered onto the highway, his legs weak and his heart pounding. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, and he flagged down the car, desperate for help. The driver, a middle-aged woman, looked concerned as she rolled down her window. "Are you okay?" she asked. "There was a gas station," Jonah stammered. "Back there. I was inside, and—" The woman's face paled. "There's no gas station on this road," she said. "Hasn't been for years. It burned down in the 80s. They never rebuilt." Jonah's blood ran cold. He climbed into the car without another word, his mind racing. As they drove away, he glanced into the side mirror. In the distance, barely visible through the darkened trees, was the faint glow of a mirror. And in its reflection, something watched him with a wide, toothy grin. The night was unusually dark, the kind of blackness that seemed to devour light. Sarah's car tires crunched along the gravel road as she made her way toward her family's old summer cabin. The cabin was deep in the woods, a place they hadn't visited in years. But after a stressful week, she thought the isolation might be exactly what she needed. The road twisted endlessly, the trees on either side forming a suffocating tunnel. She kept her high beams on, illuminating the dense forest ahead, but the light only seemed to highlight how endless the darkness truly was. Occasionally, her headlights would catch the glint of eyes in the underbrush. Deer, she told herself. Maybe raccoons. Her GPS had stopped working hours ago, but she knew the cabin was at the end of this road. She clutched the steering wheel tighter, the sound of gravel beneath her tires the only noise. That was, until she saw the first figure. It appeared out of nowhere, standing motionless on the side of the road. A man, or at least it looked like one. His face was pale and gaunt, his clothes old-fashioned, like something out of a black-and-white photograph. Sarah hit the brakes hard, her heart slamming into her ribs. "Hey!" she shouted, rolling down her window slightly. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The figure didn't move, didn't react. Sarah's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, empty. When she looked back at the road, the man was gone. Her heart raced. She hesitated, considering whether she should turn around, but the road was too narrow and she was too far in. There was no turning back now. She locked her doors and pressed forward, her car creeping along at a cautious speed. A few minutes later, she saw another figure, or maybe the same one. This time, it was a woman. She was standing in the middle of the road, her hair long and unkempt, her dress torn and stained. Sarah slowed to a crawl, her pulse pounding in her ears. The woman raised her hand and pointed into the woods. "What the hell?" Sarah whispered. She hit the horn, but the woman didn't flinch. Her arm remained raised, pointing with an unnatural stiffness. This time, Sarah didn't wait. She veered around the woman, her tires skidding slightly on the loose gravel. As she drove past, she couldn't help but glance into her rearview mirror. The woman was still there, her arm now lowered, staring after her with hollow black eyes. Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the wheel. She turned on the radio to drown out her thoughts, but all she got was static. She cycled through the stations, frustration bubbling up as each one failed to deliver anything but white noise. Then, faintly, she heard a voice. It was a woman's voice, low and distorted, whispering words Sarah couldn't make out. She turned the volume up, her ears straining to catch the message. "Don't look." Sarah's blood ran cold. She turned the radio off, her heart hammering. The forest seemed to close in around her, the shadows between the trees darker and more oppressive. The cabin came into view suddenly, its silhouette stark against the night sky. Relief flooded her as she pulled into the driveway. It looked just as she remembered it, quaint, rustic, and surrounded by trees. But something felt off. The air was too still, the silence too complete. No crickets chirped, no wind rustled the leaves. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. She grabbed her bag from the passenger seat and made her way to the front door. The wooden porch creaked under her weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, flicking on the lights. They flickered for a moment before settling into a dim, yellow glow. The cabin smelled of dust and damp wood. She dropped her bag on the couch and wandered through the small space, checking the windows and doors. Everything was locked and secure. She tried to shake the unease that clung to her like a second skin. It was just her imagination, she told herself. The long drive had spooked her. She made herself a cup of tea, the warm liquid soothing her nerves. She sat on the couch and stared out the window at the dark forest beyond. The trees seemed to shift and sway, though there was no wind. A movement caught her eye, a shadow darting between the trees. Sarah set her mug down, her body tensing. She leaned closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass. There was something out there. No, someone. A figure stood just beyond the tree line, partially obscured by the shadows. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. Sarah's heart raced as she realized it was the same figure she'd seen on the road. Her phone buzzed on the table, making her jump. She snatched it up, grateful for the distraction, but her relief vanished when she saw the screen. One new message. The number was unknown. Her fingers trembled as she opened the text. "Don't look outside." A chill ran down her spine. She glanced back at the window. The figure was gone. Her hands shook as she locked the front door and drew the curtains. She turned on every light in the cabin, her mind racing. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe she was just tired. But the message lingered in her mind like a warning. The sound of footsteps on the porch froze her in place. They were slow and deliberate, the wood creaking with each step. Sarah's breath hitched as she grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice shaking. "I'm armed." The footsteps stopped. The silence stretched, suffocating. Then came the knock, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. "Go away," she screamed. "I'll call the police." The knocking stopped abruptly. Sarah held her breath, straining to hear any sound. She backed away from the door, her knife held tightly. A loud bang came from the window behind her. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. "It's already inside." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the room. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. Then she saw it. In the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the light. The figure stood hunched, its head nearly scraping the ceiling. Its featureless face was turned toward her, and its impossibly long arms stretched out, fingers brushing the floor. Sarah screamed as the lights went out completely. The last thing she saw was the figure rushing toward her, its body twisting unnaturally as it moved. When the neighbors arrived the next morning to check on her, they found the cabin empty. The front door was locked, the windows intact, Sarah's car was still in the driveway, her belongings untouched. But on the living room wall, scrawled in what looked like ash, were the words, "It's watching." The motel sign buzzed faintly, its neon letters flickering between vacancy and ACY. It was the only sign of life Sarah and Mark had seen for miles, a lone beacon in the middle of a vast, barren stretch of desert. They hadn't planned to stop, but their car's engine had begun sputtering hours ago, and now it refused to start at all. With no cell service and the sun dipping below the horizon, the tiny roadside motel felt like their only option. "I hate this," Sarah muttered as they approached the front desk. The lobby was small and dimly lit with a faint smell of mildew. Behind the counter stood an older man with deep-set eyes and a slow, unsettling smile. "Need a room?" he asked in a gravelly voice. Mark nodded. "Yeah, just for the night." The man handed them an old-fashioned brass key, his bony fingers lingering just a little too long. "Room 6. Down the hall." The couple thanked him and hurried to the room, its door creaking loudly as Mark pushed it open. The space was sparse, a bed with a faded quilt, a small TV bolted to the wall, and a single lamp that cast long, eerie shadows. "This place is creepy," Sarah said, setting her bag on the bed. Mark shrugged. "It's just for one night. We'll leave first thing in the morning." As they settled in, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The wallpaper was peeling, the air felt unnaturally cold, and there was a faint, metallic smell she couldn't place. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the hum of the old heater in the corner. But then the noises started. It began with a soft scratching sound, like fingernails on wood. Sarah stiffened, glancing at the door. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Mark looked up from his phone. "It's probably just the wind." Sarah wasn't convinced, but she nodded, trying to calm her nerves. She crawled into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. Mark turned off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. The scratching grew louder. "Mark," Sarah hissed, her voice trembling. "It's coming from inside the room." Mark groaned and flicked on the lamp. "It's nothing." He stopped mid-sentence, his face draining of color. Sarah followed his gaze to the closet door, which was now slightly ajar. "I didn't open that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it wasn't shut all the way," Mark said, though his voice wavered. He got up and walked cautiously toward the closet. "See? It's empty." He swung the door open, revealing nothing but darkness and a few wire hangers. Sarah exhaled shakily. "Let's just get through the night." They turned the light off again, but Sarah couldn't sleep. Her eyes stayed fixed on the closet door, her body tense under the covers. The scratching returned, louder now, and accompanied by a faint whispering. She nudged Mark, but he was fast asleep. "Hello?" she called out softly, instantly regretting it. The whispering stopped. For a moment, the room was silent. Then the closet door creaked open. Sarah bolted upright, her heart hammering. "Mark, wake up!" she screamed. Mark shot up, groggy and confused. "What's—" His words were cut off by a guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Something emerged from the closet. It was humanoid, but barely. Its body was gaunt, its skin stretched taut over bones that jutted at unnatural angles. Its eyes were black pits, and its mouth was a jagged hole filled with teeth that looked more like splinters. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. Mark grabbed Sarah's arm, yanking her off the bed. "Run!" he shouted. They bolted from the room, the creature's growls echoing behind them. The hallway stretched impossibly long, its flickering lights casting erratic shadows. No matter how far they ran, the exit never seemed to get closer. Behind them, the creature was gaining. Its footsteps were uneven, yet it moved impossibly fast. Sarah could feel its icy breath on the back of her neck. They finally burst through the front door, stumbling into the cold night air. The parking lot was empty, their car nowhere in sight. The motel stood behind them, silent and foreboding, its neon sign now completely dark. "What the hell is going on?" Sarah gasped. Mark didn't answer. He was staring at something behind her, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. She turned slowly. The entire motel staff, people she hadn't even seen before, stood in a line. Their eyes were black pits, their faces slack and expressionless. They didn't move, didn't blink. "Get in!" Mark shouted, pulling her toward an old truck parked nearby. He smashed the window with a rock and climbed in, fumbling to hotwire the engine. Sarah kept her eyes on the figures, who were now moving toward them in eerie unison. The truck roared to life, and Mark slammed on the gas. The tires screeched as they sped down the gravel road, leaving the figures behind. Sarah looked back, but the motel was gone. The road stretched empty for miles. After hours of driving, they finally reached a diner, its lights a welcome sight. They stumbled inside, trembling and disheveled. The waitress behind the counter gave them a concerned look. "You two okay?" she asked. "There was a motel," Sarah stammered. "Out on Route 17. Something attacked us." The waitress frowned. "Honey, there hasn't been a motel on Route 17 for decades. Burned down in the 60s. Whole staff died in the fire." Mark and Sarah exchanged horrified looks. The metallic smell in the room, the flickering lights, the whispers. It all made sense now. As they sat in the diner trying to make sense of what had happened, Sarah's phone buzzed. She looked down at the screen. One new notification. "Room 6, your stay has ended. Please leave a review." The dirt road stretched endlessly before Emma, flanked by thick, towering pines that swallowed the weak beams of her headlights. She hadn't planned on driving through the backwoods this late, but a detour had rerouted her, and now she was hopelessly lost. Her GPS blinked aimlessly, showing her location as a blank space, and her phone had long since lost its signal. The night felt alive. The rustling of leaves, the distant hoots of owls, and the occasional crack of a branch made her jump. The air itself seemed heavy, oppressive, as if the forest were holding its breath. When her car sputtered and stalled, her heart sank. She tried the ignition again, but the engine refused to turn over. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered, slamming her palms against the wheel. Stepping out, she grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment. The night swallowed her whole as soon as she left the car. The beam of light cut through the dark but barely reached the dense forest on either side of the road. The quiet was unnerving. No animals, no wind, just silence. She popped the hood and peered inside, but the engine was a mystery to her. As she fiddled uselessly, something caught her eye, a glint in the trees. A reflection, maybe? She turned her flashlight toward it, but there was nothing there. The crunch of leaves behind her made her freeze. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The forest gave no reply. Slowly she turned, sweeping her flashlight across the road, empty. A chill crept down her spine, and she felt a sudden urge to get back in the car. She slammed the hood shut and climbed inside, locking the doors. Her breath fogged up the windshield as she sat in the darkness, gripping the wheel like a lifeline. Minutes passed. Then she saw it. Something stood at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the gloom. At first, she thought it was a person, but as her eyes adjusted, she realized it was too tall, too thin. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its posture hunched. She couldn't make out its face, but she felt its gaze piercing through the windshield, unblinking. Her chest tightened. She flicked on the headlights, and the creature vanished, swallowed by the darkness as if it had never been there. Emma's hands trembled as she reached for her phone, hoping against hope that she'd regain service. Nothing. She looked up and screamed. The thing was now closer, standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by her headlights. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tightly over its angular frame. Its head tilted unnaturally, as though studying her. Then it moved. Not walking, gliding. Its feet didn't touch the ground as it floated toward her, its limbs twisting and contorting grotesquely. Emma fumbled for the keys, praying the car would start, but the engine only groaned in protest. Come on," she shouted, tears streaming down her face. The creature was mere feet from her window now, its long fingers tapping the glass. A sound filled the car, a low, guttural whisper, like 100 voices speaking at once. "Let me in," Emma screamed again, slamming her fists against the horn. The noise blared, cutting through the silence, and the creature recoiled slightly, its head twitching violently. It hovered there for a moment before retreating back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. She didn't wait to see if it would return. Emma grabbed her bag and bolted from the car, running down the road as fast as her legs would carry her. The flashlight bounced wildly in her grip, its beam barely keeping her path illuminated. She didn't dare look back. The road seemed endless. Every step felt heavier, the air colder. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her legs burned, but she kept running. She thought she could hear footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate, matching her pace. Finally, she saw lights ahead, a small cabin nestled among the trees. She sprinted toward it, her hope surging. The door was unlocked, and she threw herself inside, slamming it shut behind her. The cabin was small and sparse, with a single room containing a table, a bed, and a wood-burning stove. A lantern hung from the ceiling, casting a warm, flickering glow. Emma collapsed onto the floor, her chest heaving. The relief was short-lived. A faint tapping came from the window. Emma's head snapped toward it. The creature was there, its face pressed against the glass, its features twisted into something resembling a smile. The lantern flickered violently, and the room grew colder. "Why? Run," the thing whispered, its voice slithering through the air. "It's already too late." The window shattered, glass spraying across the room as the creature reached inside with one impossibly long arm. Emma scrambled to her feet, grabbing the lantern and hurling it at the thing. It exploded in a burst of flames, and the creature let out an unearthly shriek, recoiling as the fire licked at its arm. Without thinking, Emma bolted out the back door, plunging into the forest. The trees closed in around her, their twisted branches clawing at her as she ran. The thing's screams echoed behind her, but it was no longer alone. Other voices joined in, a cacophony of whispers, growls, and laughter that made her ears ache. She stumbled into a clearing and fell to her knees, gasping for air. The voices stopped. The silence was deafening. Then, a hand rested on her shoulder. Emma spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty forest. Her relief turned to horror as she looked down at her own shadow. It wasn't her shape anymore. It stretched out unnaturally long, its limbs twisted and contorted, its head tilted at that impossible angle. The last thing she heard was the sound of footsteps closing in, impossibly fast. When a search party found her car days later, the doors were still locked, the keys in the ignition. There was no sign of Emma, only claw marks etched deep into the metal of the driver's side door. The forest, as always, remained silent. The old highway was infamous, a stretch of forgotten asphalt called Deadman's Loop. Locals whispered stories of people disappearing, cars breaking down with no explanation, and strange lights floating in the woods that surrounded it. But to Logan and Mia, it was just another shortcut. The couple was driving back from a camping trip, eager to get home before the predicted storm rolled in. Logan, confident behind the wheel, scoffed at Mia's reluctance. "Come on," he said with a smirk. "It's just a road. You believe in those ghost stories?" "No," Mia said, though her voice betrayed her unease. "But maybe there's a reason no one uses it anymore." "Yeah, it's called urban legends," Logan replied, turning the car onto Deadman's Loop. The trees immediately seemed to close in, their gnarled branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out the waning sunlight. The air felt heavy, thick with a strange stillness. There were no birds, no crickets, nothing but the low rumble of their car engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. Mia glanced at the map on her phone, but the screen flickered and went dark. "Great," she muttered, tapping at it uselessly. "It's fine," Logan said. "This road cuts off at least 30 minutes. We'll be back on the main highway before you know it." But the road stretched on, longer than it should have. The trees grew denser, their trunks twisted and unnatural. The asphalt cracked and crumbled, littered with debris that Logan had to swerve to avoid. And then they saw it. A car, abandoned on the side of the road. Its hood was popped and one of the doors hung open. Logan slowed down instinctively. "Don't stop," Mia said quickly. "What if someone needs help?" "Then why aren't they here?" she asked, her voice rising. "Just keep driving." Logan hesitated but pressed the gas, his eyes lingering on the car as they passed. The interior was empty, but a dark stain streaked the driver's seat. Mia caught it too, her stomach churning. "What was that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Logan didn't answer. He didn't have to. The unease in the car was palpable now, a creeping dread that seemed to settle into their bones. They continued in silence until the headlights flickered. Mia gripped the armrest. "What was that?" "Probably just a loose connection," Logan said, though he didn't sound convinced. He flicked the lights on and off, and they seemed to steady. But moments later, the engine sputtered, and the car lurched before grinding to a halt. "No, no, no," Logan muttered, turning the key. The engine whined but refused to start. Mia's breath quickened. "Why did you have to take this road?" "I'll get it working," Logan said, grabbing a flashlight and stepping out of the car. "Stay inside." Mia locked the doors and watched as Logan opened the hood. The beam of his flashlight bobbed erratically as he fiddled with the engine. The forest pressed in on all sides, its darkness absolute. Then she saw it. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow too tall, too thin, standing at the edge of the trees. But as her eyes adjusted, the figure came into focus. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were elongated, its body gaunt. Its face was featureless, just a smooth expanse of pale skin that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. "Logan!" Mia shouted, banging on the window. Logan looked up, confused. "What? Behind you!" she screamed. He turned, the flashlight beam swinging wildly, but the figure was gone. Logan scanned the tree line, his movements jerky and panicked. "There's nothing here." "Get back in the car," Mia begged. Before he could move, the flashlight flickered and died. Logan cursed, slapping it uselessly. In the brief moment of darkness, Mia saw the figure again. Closer this time, standing just behind him. "Logan," she screamed. The flashlight sputtered back to life, and Logan turned in time to see nothing. His face was pale as he hurried back to the car, slamming the door shut behind him. "We're not alone," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Logan didn't respond. He turned the key again, and this time the engine roared to life. Relief washed over them, but it was short-lived. As the car began to move, the headlights illuminated the road ahead. The figure stood directly in their path. Logan slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching. But when the car skidded to a stop, the figure was gone. "Go!" Mia shouted. "Just go!" Logan didn't need convincing. He hit the gas, the car lurching forward. The forest blurred past them as they sped down the road, but the oppressive feeling didn't fade. Mia glanced in the rearview mirror and gasped. The figure was chasing them. It didn't run. It floated, its movements impossibly fast, its limbs twisting in unnatural directions. No matter how fast Logan drove, it stayed close, its featureless face seeming to stare directly into Mia's soul. "Faster!" she screamed. "I'm trying!" Logan shouted back, the speedometer needle climbing. The road curved sharply, and Logan barely managed to keep control. As they rounded the bend, the headlights caught a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was Logan. Mia's heart stopped. She looked at the driver's seat. Logan was still there, his knuckles white on the wheel. "What the?" he started, but before he could finish, the figure in the road lunged at the car. The impact was deafening. The windshield shattered, and the car spun off the road, crashing into the trees. Darkness consumed them. When Mia opened her eyes, she was alone. The car was gone. The forest was silent, and standing in front of her, impossibly close, was the figure. Its featureless face tilted as it reached for her, its long fingers brushing against her cheek. The last thing she saw was her own reflection in the smooth, pale surface of its face, her mouth open in a silent scream. When authorities found the car days later, it was empty. The engine was intact, and there were no signs of an accident. Locals would add Logan and Mia's names to the growing list of those who had vanished on Dead Man's Loop, lost to the whispers of the forest, and whatever waited in the dark. The rain began suddenly, a torrential downpour that hammered against the roof of Adam's truck as he drove through the twisting mountain roads. He hadn't seen another car in miles, and the GPS signal had cut out long ago. He told himself it was just a storm, just a temporary inconvenience, but the unease gnawed at him. The dense forest on either side of the road felt suffocating, the trees looming like silent sentinels in the night. The headlights caught something up ahead, a sign, crooked and weathered. Black Hollow Inn, 2 miles ahead. Adam didn't remember seeing the inn on the map when he planned his route, but the thought of a warm bed and shelter from the storm was too tempting to pass up. He turned down the narrow gravel road the sign pointed to, the truck's tires slipping slightly on the wet surface. The inn emerged from the darkness like something out of a dream or a nightmare. It was an old Victorian structure, its once grand facade marred by time and neglect. The windows were dark, and the wooden porch sagged under the weight of years. "Looks charming," Adam muttered, grabbing his bag and stepping out into the rain. The air was colder here, biting through his jacket as he made his way to the front door. A rusted bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. The lobby was dimly lit, the smell of mildew and old wood filling his nostrils. Behind the counter stood a man, his face gaunt and pale, with deep-set eyes that seemed to drink in the light. "Need a room?" the man asked, his voice raspy and low. Adam hesitated. Something about the man's smile felt wrong. Yeah, just for the night." The man slid a key across the counter. "Room 7, top of the stairs." "Thanks," Adam said, pocketing the key and heading for the staircase. The wood creaked loudly under his weight, each step echoing in the silent inn. The hallway upstairs was long and dark, lit only by a single flickering bulb. Room 7 was at the end of the hall. The room itself was small and simple. A bed with a threadbare quilt, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a single window that rattled in the wind. He dropped his bag on the floor and sat on the bed, the springs groaning under him. The rain outside intensified, the sound drowning out everything else. Adam lay back, staring at the stained ceiling, and tried to ignore the creeping unease that had settled in his chest. Then he heard it. A faint scratching sound, like fingernails on wood. He sat up, his heart pounding. "Hello?" he called out. The scratching stopped. Adam shook his head, trying to laugh it off. "It's just the wind," he muttered, lying back down. But then it started again, louder this time, and closer. It was coming from the dresser. He stared at it, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, he got up and walked toward the dresser, his bare feet cold against the wooden floor. He pulled open the top drawer. Empty. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. It wasn't coming from the dresser anymore, it was coming from the window. Adam turned, his heart hammering in his chest. The rain streaked down the glass, but beyond it, something moved. A face. Pale, with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. The figure pressed its hands against the glass, the nails dragging down with a sound that made Adam's skin crawl. "Nope," he whispered, backing away from the window. He grabbed his bag and bolted out of the room, not bothering to close the door behind him. The hallway was darker now, the bulb at the far end flickering erratically. He raced down the stairs, his footsteps thunderous in the silence. The lobby was empty. The man at the counter was gone. "Hello?" Adam called out, his voice shaking. No response. He turned toward the front door, but it wouldn't budge. He yanked at it, his panic rising, but it felt as though it were nailed shut. Then the laughter started. It was soft at first, almost like a child's giggle, but it grew louder, echoing through the lobby. Adam spun around, his eyes darting to every shadow. The laughter seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment the room was filled with figures. Tall, gaunt, with faces like the one he'd seen at the window. They stood in every corner, their black eyes fixed on him, their mouths open in silent screams. The lights went out completely. Adam froze, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The darkness was absolute, the air heavy and stifling. He fumbled for his phone, desperate for any source of light, but the screen remained black. A hand brushed against his shoulder. He screamed, spinning around, but there was nothing there. The laughter returned, closer now, and he could feel hot breath on the back of his neck. "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice cracking. He stumbled backward, tripping over a chair and falling to the floor. When the lights came back on, the lobby was empty again. The figures were gone. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the storm outside. Adam didn't hesitate. He grabbed his bag and ran, his boots splashing through the puddles as he made his way back to the truck. The engine started on the first try, and he floored it, speeding away from the inn without looking back. When he finally reached the main road, he pulled over to catch his breath. His hands were shaking, his mind racing. He reached for his phone, relieved to see it had power again, but when he opened the GPS, his blood ran cold. The map showed no road where he had just driven, no inn, just a vast empty forest. And then his phone buzzed. One new notification. "Thanks for your stay at Black Hollow Inn. Come back soon." It was supposed to be a quick getaway, just a peaceful weekend at a lakeside cabin far from the noise of the city. Clara and her younger brother Liam were looking forward to hiking, swimming, and unplugging from the world. The rental was charming on the surface, a small rustic cabin perched on the edge of a glassy, secluded lake. The air was fresh, the trees vibrant with fall colors, but from the moment they arrived, Clara felt off. The first sign was the silence. No birds, no insects, just the whisper of wind through the trees. Liam joked that it was nature's version of airplane mode, but even he seemed a little uneasy. Their first night passed uneventfully, though Clara had trouble sleeping. The cabin creaked incessantly, and she swore she heard faint splashes coming from the lake outside. When she peered out the window, the moonlit water was still, untouched. She told herself it was her imagination. The next day, they explored the surrounding woods, following a narrow path that wound through towering pines. They stumbled upon an old well, its stones moss-covered and weathered. A rusted bucket hung precariously from a broken crank. "Creepy," Liam said, peering into the darkness. "Let's keep moving." Clara replied, pulling him away. She didn't know why, but the well unsettled her. It felt wrong, like it was watching them. As the sun dipped low in the sky, they returned to the cabin threatened, tired but in good spirits. Clara started dinner while Liam sat on the porch, staring out at the lake. "Hey, did you notice that?" he called out suddenly. "Notice what?" "There's something in the water. Looks like a log, maybe?" Clara joined him, squinting at the lake. Sure enough, something dark floated near the center. It didn't move with the ripples, just sat there, unnaturally still. "Probably driftwood," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. They ate in relative silence, and when night fell, Clara found herself checking the locks on the doors and windows. The floating object was still there, barely visible in the moonlight. At midnight, she woke to the sound of knocking, 3 sharp raps, then silence. She sat up, heart pounding, and strained to listen. The knocking came again, louder this time. It wasn't at the door, it was at the window. She glanced toward Liam's bed, but it was empty. Panic surged through her as she grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight. She tiptoed to the window, the beam of light trembling in her hand. Liam was outside, standing barefoot on the dock. "What the hell are you doing?" she hissed, throwing open the door. The cold air hit her like a slap, but Liam didn't react. He stared out at the lake, his posture rigid. "Liam," she called again, stepping closer. Her flashlight caught his face, and she froze. His eyes were wide and glassy, his pupils blown. His lips moved, but no sound came out. "Liam, come inside," she begged, grabbing his arm. His skin was ice cold, but he didn't resist as she pulled him back toward the cabin. Once inside, he collapsed onto the floor, shaking violently. Clara wrapped him in a blanket and tried to get him to talk, but he only muttered incoherently. She caught snippets of his words. "The water, it's calling, can't look away." She stayed up all night watching him, terrified he might try to leave again. At dawn, his fever broke, and he finally spoke. "I don't remember going outside," he said, his voice hoarse. "I had this dream. I was walking into the lake, and there were these hands pulling me under." Clara didn't tell him about the wet footprints she had found leading from the lake to the dock. Determined to leave, she began packing their things, but when she tried to start the car, the engine refused to turn over. The cell service was still non-existent. They were trapped. The floating object was gone. By nightfall, the tension in the cabin was unbearable. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind set Clara's nerves on edge. Liam had grown quiet, his gaze often drifting to the window. She blocked it with a heavy curtain, but it didn't seem to help. As the clock neared midnight, the knocking returned. 3 slow, deliberate raps on the front door. "Don't answer it," Liam whispered, his voice trembling. "I wasn't planning on it," Clara replied, clutching a fire poker. The knocks came again, louder, more insistent. Then the doorknob began to rattle. "Who's there?" Clara shouted, her voice breaking. The rattling stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, from the back of the cabin, came the sound of shattering glass. "They're inside," Liam whispered, his face pale. Clara grabbed his hand, dragging him toward the bathroom. They locked themselves inside, holding their breath as the sounds of footsteps echoed through the cabin. Slow, deliberate, heavy. Something moved outside the bathroom door. A low, guttural whisper seeped through the wood, unintelligible but filled with malice. Then the whispering stopped. For a long time, there was silence. Clara dared to hope that whatever it was had gone. But when she opened the door, the cabin was empty, and so was the lake. The water was gone. The muddy lake bed stretched out like a gaping wound, and at its center stood a figure. It was tall and skeletal, its arms unnaturally long, its head tilted as if it were listening. And then it smiled. The thing began to move, gliding across the lake bed toward the cabin. Its hollow eyes locked on Clara as it raised one hand and pointed directly at her. "Run," she whispered, shoving Liam toward the truck. They sprinted through the darkness, the sound of wet, slapping footsteps growing louder behind them. The truck's engine roared to life on the first try, and they peeled out onto the gravel road. When they reached the main highway, Clara glanced in the rearview mirror. The lake was full again, its surface calm and still. But she swore she could see something standing on the dock, watching them disappear into the night. The drive through the desert was supposed to be uneventful. Sam had planned to take the desolate stretch of Highway 49 to save time, cutting through the barren, sun-scorched land. It was just him and his beat-up sedan, the gas tank full and the playlist humming softly through the speakers. But as the miles stretched on, the endless sand and scrub brush began to wear on him. The road seemed to go on forever, without a single sign of civilization. Then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, he saw it, a lone gas station, its neon sign flickering weakly in the growing darkness. Sam pulled in, grateful for the break. The station was a relic of another era, its pumps rusty and its windows clouded with grime. A single bulb above the door cast a sickly yellow glow, attracting a swarm of moths. The sign on the door read, "Open," though it felt as if no one had been there in years. He stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling weakly. The interior was dimly lit, rows of dusty shelves stocked with faded candy bars and canned goods. Behind the counter stood an old man, his skin leathery and weathered, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a battered cowboy hat. "Evenin'," the man drawled, his voice gravelly. "Evening," Sam replied. "Just need to top off the tank." The old man nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on Sam. "Pump's still working. Pay after you're done." Sam gave a small nod and headed back outside, feeling the man's eyes on him the whole time. He filled the tank quickly, eager to get back on the road, but as he replaced the nozzle, he noticed something strange. There was another car parked at the far end of the lot. It was old, a classic muscle car with faded paint and cracked windows. It hadn't been there when he arrived. He glanced around but saw no sign of its owner. "Probably inside," he muttered, brushing it off. He went back into the station, handing the old man a 20. "Bit late to be driving this road," the old man said, his voice slow and deliberate. "Yeah," Sam replied, forcing a smile, "just trying to make good time." The old man nodded, but his expression darkened. "You be careful out there." Sam frowned. "Why's that?" The old man leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "This road ain't right after dark. Folks see things, hear things that ain't supposed to be there." Sam chuckled nervously, assuming it was just a way to scare tourists. "I'll be fine. Thanks for the warning." The old man didn't laugh. He simply stared as Sam walked out the door. The air outside felt colder now, the wind picking up and carrying with it a faint, unplaceable smell. Sam shook it off and climbed into his car, starting the engine and pulling back onto the highway. The first hour was uneventful, the road stretching endlessly before him. The stars were brilliant overhead, the moon casting a pale glow on the desert landscape. But then, in the distance, he saw headlights. They were faint at first, but they grew brighter as they approached. A car sped past him going the opposite direction, its engine roaring. Sam barely caught a glimpse of it, but his heart skipped a beat. It looked exactly like the muscle car he'd seen at the gas station. "That's weird," he muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. Minutes later, he saw the headlights again, this time in his rearview mirror. The same car was behind him now, its headlights blindingly bright. It followed him closely, its engine growling as if urging him to speed up. Sam pressed the gas pedal, his pulse quickening. The car matched his speed effortlessly, its headlights never wavering. He glanced in the mirror again, but the driver's seat was empty. "No way," he whispered, his breath hitching. The car's engine roared louder, and it began to swerve as if trying to force him off the road. Sam's hands shook as he gripped the wheel, his heart hammering in his chest. He slammed on the brakes, hoping to let the car pass, but when he skidded to a stop, the other car was gone. The silence was deafening. Sam sat there for a moment, trying to calm his racing heart. The road ahead was empty again, and the desert stretched out in all directions, eerily still. He took a deep breath and started driving again. Slower this time. A mile down the road, his headlights caught something on the shoulder. A figure. It was a man, standing perfectly still, his back to the road. As Sam passed, the man's head turned slowly, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow. Sam didn't stop. He didn't even look back. His foot pressed harder on the gas, his mind racing. The road seemed to stretch endlessly now, twisting and turning in ways it hadn't before. The mile markers he'd been counting were gone, replaced by jagged wooden posts that jutted out of the ground like broken teeth. And then he saw it again, the gas station. "No," he whispered, his grip on the wheel tightening. "That's not possible." The same neon sign flickered weakly. The same old man stood behind the counter, visible through the dusty windows. Sam pulled into the lot, his hands trembling. The old man came out onto the porch, his expression grim. "Didn't listen, did ya?" he said, shaking his head. "What's happening?" Sam demanded. Why am I back here? The old man didn't answer. He pointed to the horizon where the faint glow of headlights appeared once more. You can't outrun it, he said. You can't leave this road. Not at night. Sam turned to look, but the headlights were already closer, impossibly fast. The roar of the muscle car's engine filled the air, louder and louder, until it was deafening. And then, just as the headlights blinded him, everything went black. When the sun rose over the desert the next morning, Highway 49 was empty. The gas station was gone, as if it had never been there. Travelers passing through might notice a single rusted sedan abandoned on the shoulder, its doors locked and its driver missing. They wouldn't stop, though. No one stops on Highway 49 after dark. Not anymore.